Okay, listen, I absolutely need to tell you about what went down yesterday on NBA Today because it was legitimately one of the most revealing and strategically complex discussions about the New York Knicks' evolving trade deadline plans that I've witnessed on that show all season long. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that Malika Andrews, Brian Windhorst, Kendrick Perkins, and the entire panel spent nearly 2 hours dissecting how the Knicks have completely pivoted away from their initial interest in Chris Paul to now exploring this fascinating constellation of backup point guard options, including Jose Alvarado, TJ McConnell, and potentially even Coby White from the Chicago Bulls, who's suddenly emerged as this incredibly intriguing target that could solve multiple roster construction problems simultaneously. And the way they broke down everything from why the Knicks initially had internal discussions about acquiring CP3 before ultimately backing away from that idea to what specific skill sets they're prioritizing in a backup playmaker to how Coby White represents this perfect blend of youth, scoring punch, and playmaking ability that could complement Jalen Brunson both as a starter or coming off the bench, had everyone in the studio completely engrossed, because this isn't just about the Knicks. Making some minor roster tweak at the margins, this is about Leon Rose and the front office recognizing they have a legitimate championship window right now in what they perceive as a weakened Eastern Conference, and making aggressive win-now moves to maximize their chances of breaking through to the finals for the first time in decades. Hey, what's up, everyone? Before we jump in, let me ask you something that takes 1 second. That like button? Hitting it right now helps this channel more than you know. It's how we reach thousands more fans with this content. Just smash that like button real quick. It's the biggest way you can support what we're building here. Every like matters, so hit it now. So NBA Today opens, and Malika Andrews has this knowing expression on her face, like she's about to reveal inside information that's going to completely reframe how people think about the Knicks' trade deadline strategy. And she immediately sets the context by acknowledging that yes, everyone wants to talk endlessly about the Giannis Antetokounmpo sweepstakes and whether New York has any realistic shot of pulling off that kind of franchise-altering blockbuster deal. But the reality that's getting lost in all that speculation is that the Knicks are actually actively working the phones right now, exploring more modest but still impactful trades that could happen well before the February deadline. And Malika cites this report from Stephen Bondy of the New York Post, who has excellent sources within the Knicks organization. And according to Bondy's reporting, the front office is specifically searching for point guard depth to back up Jalen Brunson. And they've already had preliminary discussions about trades involving multiple players, including Chris Paul, who's currently with the San Antonio Spurs and has been mentioned in trade rumors for weeks now. And Brian Windhorst, who always has his finger on the pulse of what's happening behind the scenes around the league, immediately jumps in with this fascinating context about why the Knicks were initially interested in Chris Paul and what specifically changed to make them back away from pursuing that deal. And Windhorst explains that according to Bondy's reporting, Chris Paul was a name the Knicks discussed internally as a target for the backup point guard role even before Landry Shamet suffered that shoulder injury that's going to keep him out for an extended period. So this wasn't some panic reaction to losing depth due to injury. This was part of their longer-term roster construction, thinking about what they needed to maximize their championship odds this season. But then Windhorst cites the follow-up reporting from Ian Begley, who's another incredibly well-connected Knicks insider. And Begley stated that while there's been a lot of speculation connecting Chris Paul to the Knicks, he's been told it's highly unlikely at this point for that to actually come to fruition because the Knicks have essentially changed their trade plans and moved on from CP3 as a target. Kendrick Perkins then jumps in and starts getting really animated about why the Knicks made the right decision by backing away from Chris Paul. And Perk brings up this additional reporting from Stephen Bondy, who doubled down on his Chris Paul scoop, but also added this editorial opinion that the Knicks absolutely should stay away from acquiring Paul. And Perkins reads this quote from Bondy that I thought was pretty brutal, but also probably accurate. Where Bondi says, it's not just that Paul is 40 years old with a declining field goal percentage, it's that when you get Paul, you get everything that comes with him, including that alpha personality who dictates terms rather than fits in, who can be difficult to work with, and who's had conflicts with teammates and coaches throughout his career. And Perk makes this impassioned argument about how the Knicks have built such incredible chemistry and locker room culture under Tom Thibodeau, with guys who are willing to sacrifice individual glory for team success, and bringing in someone with Chris Paul's personality and history of friction could potentially disrupt that delicate balance, even if his on-court contributions would be valuable in limited minutes as a backup playmaker. Richard Jefferson, who was also on the panel, then provides some interesting historical context about veteran point guards who've been traded to contending teams late in their careers. And RJ talks about how sometimes those moves work out beautifully, like when Andre Iguodala joined the Warriors and became this perfect glue guy, but other times, you get situations where the veteran player can't accept a reduced role, or clashes with the coaching staff about playing time and shot distribution. And Jefferson makes this point that the Knicks need to be really careful about the type of veteran they bring in, because they're not just looking for basketball skills, they need someone who understands and accepts that they're going to be playing behind Jalen Brunson, who's an all-NBA level player, and the unquestioned leader of that backcourt. And not every veteran point guard who's been a starter and primary ball handler for most of their career can psychologically accept that kind of subordinate role without it becoming a problem. But here's where the NBA Today discussion took this absolutely fascinating turn that I honestly hadn't anticipated. Malika Andrews introduces Kobe White from the Chicago Bulls into the conversation, and the more the panel talked about White as a potential Knicks target, the more sense it made from multiple different strategic angles. And Brian Windhorst starts breaking down why the Knicks would be interested in White, beginning with the most fundamental roster construction need, which is that New York desperately wants a second playmaker and shot creator who can operate alongside Jalen Brunson in the starting lineup, or come off the bench as an incredibly impactful sixth man who can carry offensive load when Brunson sits. And Windhorst cites White's production this season, showing he's averaging 24 points and 5 assists per game, which are legitimate starting caliber numbers, and White provides this offensive versatility where he can score in multiple ways, whether it's spotting up for catch-and-shoot threes, attacking closeouts and getting to the rim, or creating his own shot off the dribble with pull-up jumpers and step-back threes. Kendrick Perkins then jumps in talking about how White's skill set would be particularly valuable for Tom Thibodeau's system. And Perk makes this point about how Thibodeau has always valued offensive flexibility and having multiple guys who can initiate offense and make plays, especially after the addition of Karl Anthony Towns somewhat shifted the team's focus more toward offense and spacing, compared to previous iterations of the Knicks that were built primarily around defense and physicality. And Perkins talks about how adding White would give the Knicks this three-guard rotation with Brunson and potentially Deuce McBride, where you could stagger minutes strategically and always have at least two capable ball handlers and shot creators on the floor at all times, which prevents those offensive droughts that plague teams when their primary star sits, and nobody else can generate quality looks in the half-court. Richard Jefferson then addresses White's shooting ability specifically and why that would be so valuable for the Knicks' spacing and offensive efficiency. And RJ points out that White is shooting 37% from three-point range this season on solid volume, which immediately makes him one of the better perimeter shooters on New York's roster. And Jefferson makes this observation that the Knicks have struggled at times this season when defenses load up on Brunson and Towns in pick-and-roll situations and dare the role players to beat them with outside shooting, and having another legitimate three-point threat like White, who defenders actually have to respect and close out hard against, would create so much more space for everyone else to operate and make the offense significantly harder to defend. And RJ emphasizes that White isn't just a stationary spot-up shooter, He can shoot off movement coming around screens, and he can pull up off the dribble in transition, so he gives you multiple different ways to generate quality three-point attempts, which is exactly what modern NBA offenses need to thrive. But then, Malika Andrews steers the conversation toward why the Chicago Bulls might actually be motivated to trade Coby White, despite him being a productive player in his mid-20s who should theoretically be part of their long-term core. And Malika explains that White is entering the final year of his contract in 2025 to 26 and will become an unrestricted free agent in 2026, which creates this complicated situation for the Bulls. And Malika cites reporting indicating that Chicago faces a salary cap dilemma where they potentially can't offer White the kind of contract extension he's going to command on the open market given his production and age. So the Bulls front office has to weigh whether it's better to try keeping White and risk losing him for nothing in free agency versus trading him now while his value is high and receiving quality assets in return, whether that's draft picks or young players who fit their timeline better. Brian Windhorst then dives deeper into the Bulls' organizational situation and why they might be going through a roster restructuring that makes White expendable despite his talent. And Windhorst talks about how Chicago is clearly at this crossroads where they're not good enough to seriously compete for championships, but they're not bad enough to completely bottom out and accumulate high lottery picks. So they're stuck in this purgatory of mediocrity that front offices absolutely hate. And Windhorst explains that the arrival of Josh Giddey to the Bulls roster has created some interesting positional overlap questions where both Giddey and White are guards who need the ball in their hands to be maximally effective. And there are legitimate concerns about whether they can coexist long-term or if having both of them creates a logjam in the backcourt that prevents either player from reaching their full potential. And Windhorst makes this point that if the Bulls have decided they're going to build around Giddey as one of their core young pieces, then it might make sense to trade White now and get value back, rather than waiting and potentially losing him for nothing when he hits free agency. Kendrick Perkins then jumps in with this passionate take about why Coby White would be an absolutely perfect fit for what the Knicks need both on and off the court. And Perk talks about how White has shown throughout his time in Chicago that he can play effectively, both as a starter and coming off the bench. He doesn't need to dominate the ball to be productive, and he's willing to defer to bigger stars and play within the flow of the offense, rather than forcing things or taking bad shots out. A frustration about his role. And Perkins makes this comparison, saying that White reminds him of some of those really valuable sixth-man types who've won championships with various teams over the years. Guys who are talented enough to start, but understand their role is to provide scoring punch and energy off the bench. And that mentality and basketball IQ is exactly what championship contenders need from their depth pieces, because you can't have guys pouting about minutes or shot attempts when the playoffs come around and rotations get tightened. But then Richard Jefferson brings up what I thought was a really important counterpoint that the panel needed to address, and RJ asks whether the Knicks should even be prioritizing backup point guard help, given that they already have Jalen Brunson, who's an Iron Man who rarely misses games and plays heavy minutes, and they have Deuce McBride, who's been absolutely fantastic this season when he's gotten opportunity, and they even have Tyler Kolek, who's a young point guard the team clearly likes and wants to develop. And Jefferson makes this argument that maybe, instead of adding another guard, the Knicks should be focusing their trade deadline efforts on acquiring more size, whether that's a backup center to give them depth behind Karl Anthony Towns, or a bigger wing defender who can guard multiple positions and provide versatility, or maybe a true power forward who can rebound and defend at a high level, because those seem like more pressing needs than backcourt depth, given how well the Knicks have been managing the non-Brunson minutes with McBride stepping up. Malika Andrews then brings up this reporting from Stefan Bondi, who listed 9 different guards that NBA executives believe could be available before the February trade deadline, and the panel starts going through some of these names to evaluate which ones would actually make sense for the Knicks versus which ones are probably non-starter. And beyond Chris Paul, who we've already discussed, The list apparently includes Jose Alvarado from the Pelicans, Trey Jones from the Spurs, Tyus Jones, who's his older brother, and TJ McConnell from the Pacers, among others. And Brian Windhorst immediately jumps on the TJ McConnell mention and starts talking about how McConnell would be an absolutely perfect fit for the Knicks if Indiana were actually willing to trade him, because McConnell embodies everything that Tom Thibodeau values in terms of effort, hustle, defensive intensity, and winning basketball. And even though Knicks fans probably hate playing against McConnell when he's on the Pacers, he's exactly the type of player who would become beloved instantly if he was wearing a Knicks jersey and providing that energy off the bench. Kendrick Perkins then gets really animated, agreeing with Windhorst about McConnell, but also being realistic about the likelihood of that trade actually happening. And Perk says that even though McConnell would be a championship-chasing type of move, if it's feasible, it's incredibly difficult to imagine the Pacers parting with him, given how integral he was to their finals run, and how much their coaching staff and locker room values his contribution. And Perkins makes this additional point that even if Indiana did decide to make McConnell available, which seems unlikely, they would never in a million years trade him to a division rival like the Knicks, who they're going to be competing against for playoff seeding and potentially facing in the postseason. So it's just not a realistic scenario, no matter how much sense it makes from a basketball fit perspective. Richard Jefferson then shifts the focus to Jose Alvarado as potentially the most realistic target from that list of guards, and RJ talks about how Alvarado brings this incredible defensive intensity and aggressiveness that would translate perfectly to playing for Thibodeau and the Knicks' defensive system. And Jefferson acknowledges that Alvarado isn't a traditional point guard in terms of being a primary playmaker and facilitator, but he's absolutely a 3-and-D type player who can knock down open threes at a respectable clip while also hounding opposing ball handlers and creating turnovers with his pesky on-ball defense. And RJ makes this observation that Alvarado is wildly underrated as a playmaker. Despite not having huge assist numbers, he makes the right read consistently and doesn't turn the ball over at high rates. And that type of smart decision-making and basketball IQ is exactly what you need from backup guards who are going to be asked to run the offense for short stretches when your star point guards sit. But then Malika Andrews brings the conversation back to Coby White and tries to synthesize all the different threads about why he makes so much sense for the Knicks, despite some of the other options they're exploring. And Malika makes this argument that White represents the best combination of youth, production, positional versatility, and realistic acquisition cost compared to the other guards on that list. And Malika points out that White is only 25 years old, which means he fits the Knicks' competitive timeline much better than someone like Chris Paul, who's 40. He's putting up 20 points and 5 assists, which is significantly more offensive production than you'd get from a Jose Alvarado or TJ McConnell, and his contract situation with the Bulls makes a trade much more feasible than trying to pry away someone like Tyus Jones from Orlando, who's on a team that believes they can compete for a championship this season. Brian Windhorst then addresses the potential trade package and what it would actually cost the Knicks to acquire Coby White from Chicago. And Windhorst speculates that the Bulls probably aren't going to demand an overwhelming haul given White's impending free agency and their motivation to get value back rather than lose him for nothing. And Windhorst suggests that a package built around maybe Tyler Kolek plus a protected first-round pick or some combination of second-rounders might be enough to get preliminary conversations started, especially if the Bulls are more focused on clearing future cap space and accumulating draft capital than they are on getting back an established rotation player who helps them win games immediately. And Windhorst emphasizes that from the Knicks' perspective, this would represent a relatively low-risk move, where you're not gutting your core or sacrificing major future assets. You're essentially upgrading your backup point guard spot with a younger, more productive player who could potentially slide into the starting lineup alongside Brunson if Thibodeau wanted to experiment with different lineup combinations. Kendrick Perkins then makes this passionate closing argument about why the Knicks need to be aggressive at this trade deadline, regardless of whether it's Kobe White or one of the other guard options they're exploring. And Perk talks about how New York has a legitimate championship window right now in what they correctly perceive as a weakened Eastern Conference, where there isn't a dominant juggernaut like previous years, when you had the peak Big Three Heat or the 73-win Warriors out west. And Perkins cites these updated championship odds from FanDuel, showing Oklahoma City at the top, followed by Denver, Houston, and then the Knicks sitting at plus 1,100, which represents a real legitimate chance to win it all if everything breaks right. And Perk emphasizes that these opportunities don't come around often for franchises. The Knicks haven't been to the finals since 1999, which is approaching 3 decades ago, so when you have a roster this talented with Brunson and Towns and Bridges, and you're healthy and playing well, you have an obligation to your fans and to your organization to go all in and make whatever moves give you the best chance to capitalize on this window before it potentially closes. What really struck me watching this entire NBA Today segment was how thoroughly and strategically the panel evaluated not just the basketball fit of various trade targets, but also the organizational dynamics and motivations that would make deals feasible or unrealistic. Because it's one thing to say TJ McConnell would be perfect for the Knicks, but it's another thing entirely to acknowledge that Indiana would never trade him to a division rival, no matter what you offer. And I think the consensus among everyone was that Kobe White represents this really interesting sweet spot where he's young enough and productive enough to be a genuine difference maker. The Bulls have legitimate reasons to move him before his contract expires, and the acquisition cost probably wouldn't be prohibitive for a Knicks team that wants to preserve their core while adding meaningful depth that could push them over the top in a wide-open Eastern Conference, where multiple teams believe they have legitimate championship chances this season.